Samuel Bridger's cabin design was mocked by everyone who saw it, until the cold proved his doubters wrong. What seemed like an oddity would soon become the most important invention in the wilderness. If you're enjoying the story, hit that subscribe button and stay tuned for the next chapter. Samuel Bridger stood on the edge of his work site, his hands resting on the rough-hewn logs of what was supposed to be his greatest achievement. The sun had already dipped behind the mountains, casting long shadows over the snow-dusted ground. His breath came in short, visible puffs as he surveyed the cabin he was building. It wasn't much to look at yet, just a rough skeleton of logs bound together in the shape of a cylinder. But to Samuel, it was everything. The design was simple but revolutionary, a cabin shaped not with corners and sharp edges, but with a smooth, curved form. A tube, as some had called it. He had worked for weeks, scavenging materials, cutting down trees, stripping bark, and shaping the logs. Every detail mattered. He didn't care about the jokes or the skepticism from the other trappers who camped nearby. Samuel had learned early in his life that innovation never came without its fair share of ridicule. "Samuel, what in blazes are you doing?" John Carver, an older trapper who had known Samuel since his first winter in the Rockies, had asked when he first saw the construction. His voice was thick with disbelief. "You're wasting your time, boy. Look, a round cabin? You'll freeze to death in there, mark my words." John wasn't alone. As Samuel's work continued, he saw the same looks, the same shaking heads. Men who had been trapping in these mountains for decades scoffed at him. They built their cabins quickly, roughly, and efficiently, the same way their fathers had. Samuel's new method, with its curved walls and intricate details, seemed like an unnecessary luxury in a world where survival was the only true measure of success. But Samuel had a vision. He had seen the way the wind howled through the cracks of a traditional log cabin, how the cold crept in at the corners and through the gaps in the door. He had felt the sting of frostbite after a long day of trapping, knowing that his shelter couldn't protect him from the brutal elements. The standard cabins, sturdy as they were, weren't enough. He needed something that would seal in warmth, keep out the chill, and withstand the elements, and this tube cabin was his answer. Still, despite his determination, doubt gnawed at him. He couldn't shake the feeling that everyone around him was right. What if it didn't work? What if all this effort, all the extra time, ended in failure? But even then, Samuel couldn't let go of his idea. He had come too far. The other men's mockery only fueled his resolve to prove them wrong. One day, as he labored on, the first real test would come, not from the biting cold, but from the most unexpected of places, the growing whispers of his peers. Would they continue to laugh, or would they come to see what he had built? Samuel didn't know, but he was ready to face whatever came next. The cold was relentless. As the first flakes of snow began to fall in early October, Samuel's hands stiffened, the work growing more difficult with each passing day. He had grown used to the harsh winters of the Rockies, but this season felt different. It wasn't just the chill in the air, it was the weight of what he was attempting. Every time he drove another log into place, every time he stripped away bark and shaped the wood, he felt the doubt creeping in again. The tube cabin wasn't finished yet, and the days were getting shorter. The other trappers had long since completed their shelters, their fires crackling from inside snug, well-constructed cabins. Samuel's cabin stood as a half-formed skeleton, a project that had consumed his every waking hour. The cabin was his lifeline, the thing that would make his trapping life more bearable, more efficient. Yet it was also the thing that had drawn scorn from every direction. Samuel's stomach churned every time he passed the makeshift camps of the other trappers. They all had their usual cabins, built fast and functional. Their walls were hastily notched, the roofs a patchwork of bark and sod. Samuel's work was different. His cabin wasn't built for speed. It was built for survival. That morning the temperature had dropped sharply. The wind howled through the trees, sending flurries of snow swirling into the air. Samuel had only just begun to trim another log when he heard a distant shout. "Bridger!" It was John Carver again, his gruff voice cutting through the wind. "You're wasting time. Ain't no cabin gonna stand against this kind of cold. You'll freeze in there faster than you can blink." Samuel didn't respond. The words were all too familiar now. John, like everyone else, didn't understand what Samuel was trying to accomplish. They thought it was foolish to spend so much time on something that could easily be replaced by a quick, simple cabin. But Samuel wasn't interested in a cabin that would last for only a few seasons. He needed something stronger, something that could endure the brutal winters and protect him from more than just the cold. As the storm grew fiercer, Samuel could feel the bite of the wind cutting through his coat. He took a deep breath, looking at the cabin's framework. It was far from complete, but it was holding up better than he expected. The round shape was starting to take form. The curves would make a difference. He was certain of it. The sharp edges of a traditional cabin caught the wind, making them vulnerable to the cold. His design, though still unfinished, was meant to deflect the wind and keep the warmth in. But with each gust of wind that howled around him, Samuel knew that time was running out. He had to finish before the snow piled too high, before the temperatures plunged even lower. He had to prove the skeptics wrong, starting with himself. He stood up, pushing through the exhaustion. The cabin needed more work, but so did he. This wasn't just about building a shelter. It was about survival. He had no choice but to keep moving forward no matter how cold it got. Samuel Bridger had always been a practical man. Raised by a father who taught him the basics of carpentry, he had learned to build, fix, and adapt from an early age. His father's methods had been simple, but they had always worked. There was no room for excess, no tolerance for mistakes. You did the job right, or you didn't do it at all. As he stood in the shadow of his unfinished cabin, Samuel remembered those lessons well. His father had often told him that survival wasn't about fancy tools or intricate designs. It was about understanding the materials and working with them, not against them. Samuel had taken those words to heart, but as he looked at the rough structure in front of him, he realized that what he was attempting was something different altogether. He wasn't just trying to survive the wilderness, he was trying to make it easier. The snow had continued to fall, blanketing the ground in a thick layer of white. Samuel hadn't been able to make much progress that day, but his mind had been working overtime. He thought about his father's log cabin back in Kentucky, the way the logs fit together so perfectly, the roof that had never leaked, the warmth that had kept his family comfortable through the coldest winters. That cabin had been built with a simple understanding of how materials worked together. But Samuel knew his cabin needed more. It needed to stand against not only the wind and the snow, but the harshest challenges the wilderness could throw at it. He wasn't just building a shelter, he was building a fortress, and for that he needed something stronger than what he had been taught. As he walked around the cabin, Samuel touched the smooth curve of the walls, running his fingers along the logs. The idea for the tube cabin had come to him in the middle of a particularly fierce storm a few months earlier. The wind had howled through the gaps in his shelter, and the cold had seeped through every crack. But what if the shape of the cabin could help? What if the rounded design would minimize the wind's impact, making it easier to heat and harder to breach? Samuel hadn't learned these principles from his father. No, these were ideas he had come up with on his own, ideas forged from necessity. He thought about the future, about how his design could save lives, not just his own, but the lives of others who would come to this land after him. That night, as the wind screamed outside, Samuel lay awake in the dark, listening to the storm. He thought about his father, who had always believed in working with his hands, in using the tools of the earth to create something lasting. Samuel knew this. Cabin, this new design, was his way of doing just that. It was his legacy. In the world Samuel had chosen to live in, every day was a struggle for survival. But the struggle wasn't always against nature. Sometimes it was against the limitations of the world around him. Every task, every goal required resources, and in the Rockies, those resources were often in short supply. That day, Samuel found himself trudging through the deepening snow, his breath coming out in harsh, visible puffs. The other trappers had all gone to the usual places to collect wood, close to their camps, where the trees were plentiful and the work was easy. But Samuel had a different idea. His cabin required the best materials, the strongest wood. He wasn't about to settle for anything less. He had learned early on that the best wood wasn't always the easiest to get. Most trappers cut down whatever trees were convenient, but Samuel needed logs that were straight and sturdy, logs that could fit together without gaps. The trees in the area had been picked over by other trappers, leaving the best options miles away, deep in the forest. The trip to find suitable wood wasn't an easy one. The snow was deep, and the wind cut through his clothing like a knife. But Samuel wasn't about to give up. He had already invested so much time and energy into the cabin, he couldn't afford to let something like a snowstorm stop him now. After hours of trudging through the snow, Samuel finally reached the area he had in mind. The trees here were taller, their trunks thick and straight, just what he needed. He selected the first few logs carefully, measuring them in his mind before cutting them down. He had learned the importance of precision. If the logs weren't perfect, the whole cabin could collapse under the weight of its own design. The work was exhausting. Each log had to be cut down, stripped of its bark, and hauled back to the cabin site, a journey that took several hours. But Samuel's determination never wavered. He couldn't afford to cut corners. If he wanted the cabin to be as strong as it needed to be, he had to ensure every piece was perfect. By the time Samuel made it back to his cabin, the day was nearly over. His hands were numb from the cold, and his body ached from the physical toll of hauling the heavy logs. But as he looked at the materials he had gathered, he felt a sense of satisfaction. This was what he had been working toward, each log, each piece of wood, bringing him closer to his goal. The days continued to stretch longer and colder, each one bringing with it a fresh layer of snow. Samuel worked tirelessly, his hands raw from the unrelenting labor. Yet, despite his persistence, the cabin was far from finished. The logs had been cut, but the work of shaping and fitting them together was painstakingly slow. There were moments when Samuel wondered if he had made a mistake. Maybe the trappers who mocked him were right after all. Maybe this design wasn't worth the time and effort. One afternoon, while Samuel was out gathering firewood, he heard the crunch of boots in the snow behind him. At first he thought it was one of the usual men who had laughed at his cabin, here to mock him once more. But when he turned around, it wasn't John Carver or any of the other familiar faces he had come to expect. It was a young trapper named Isaac Miller, a man who had only recently arrived in the area. Isaac was dressed in thick furs, his face young but weathered from the harsh conditions. Unlike the others, Isaac didn't carry an air of superiority. His eyes held a certain curiosity, a genuine interest that Samuel couldn't ignore. "I heard you were building something unusual," Isaac said, his voice steady despite the cold. "A round cabin, they say." Samuel stood there for a moment, unsure how to respond. The other trappers had all mocked him for the same thing, as if his design was some foolish whim. But Isaac's tone wasn't one of ridicule. There was something else there, something closer to respect, or at least interest. "I guess you could say that," Samuel answered, wiping his brow and pulling his coat tighter against the cold. "I've been watching you," Isaac continued, "and I think you're on to something. My old man always said, if you're going to do something, make sure it lasts." That was all Samuel needed to hear. He studied Isaac for a moment, weighing his words. He didn't know much about the young trapper, but there was something about him that seemed different from the others. Isaac didn't come with preconceived notions, didn't judge him or his work. He simply saw the potential. "Why don't you come by my camp tomorrow?" Samuel asked, his voice firm but welcoming. "If you're willing to help, I could use another pair of hands." Isaac smiled, his teeth flashing white against his sun-darkened skin. "I'll be there. I've got a feeling this cabin's going to be something worth seeing." From that moment, an unexpected alliance was formed. Isaac helped Samuel with the logs, with the shaping and fitting. They worked side by side, and in the process, Samuel found that Isaac's methods were different, yet complementary. Isaac had a fresh perspective that Samuel hadn't considered before. The two of them made an unlikely team: Samuel, the determined innovator, and Isaac, the curious learner. Together, they worked to finish the cabin, one log at a time. As the days passed, Samuel began to feel a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't alone in his quest anymore. Isaac's help and encouragement gave him the strength to keep moving forward. And for the first time since he had started, Samuel felt confident that the cabin might just become more than a dream. By the end of the week, the cabin had begun to take shape in ways Samuel had only imagined. The round structure was slowly being completed, each log meticulously placed, and the foundation, strong as it was, began to show its potential. The curved walls were beginning to look more like the cabin Samuel had envisioned, one that would stand against the wind, one that would hold in the warmth during the bitter cold of the Rockies. But with every piece of the cabin that fell into place, Samuel felt the weight of the trapper's skepticism on his shoulders. The ridicule hadn't stopped. The men who passed by Samuel's work site still laughed at the unusual design. They didn't understand the time and energy Samuel had poured into this project. They couldn't see what he saw, the possibilities that lay in this unorthodox structure. Isaac, however, never wavered. Every day he showed up, ready to work, eager to help. He wasn't just interested in the cabin's design, he was interested in Samuel's vision. The young trapper didn't question it or dismiss it as foolish. Isaac believed in the idea, believed it had potential. For that reason alone, Samuel found himself appreciating Isaac's company more than he had anticipated. One cold morning, as they worked on the walls, John Carver appeared at the edge of the work site. He stood, arms crossed, watching them with a look of disbelief. His eyes flicked over the structure, taking in the cylindrical shape, the large logs, the precision of the fit. "Well, well," John said with a laugh, stepping forward, "you two really think this is going to work? You think this thing is going to keep you warm when winter really hits?" Isaac stood taller, his gaze fixed firmly on John. "It already is keeping us warm," Isaac said calmly, his voice not giving an inch. "You're too used to the old ways, John. You can't see what's in front of you." Samuel could feel the tension rising. He had heard John's criticisms for weeks, but he hadn't expected Isaac to defend him so quickly. The words weren't just an answer, they were a challenge. "This is different," Isaac continued. "It's better, and it's time someone did things differently out here. Maybe you should try it before you judge it." John's eyes narrowed, but there was a flicker of something in them. Curiosity, perhaps, or the faintest hint of respect. "We'll see, won't we?" he muttered, before turning and walking away. As John disappeared into the distance, Isaac looked at Samuel, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Maybe they'll learn," Isaac said. Samuel nodded, his eyes following John's retreating figure. For the first time in weeks, he felt the weight of the ridicule begin to lift. He wasn't just building a cabin anymore, he was building a new future. The wind howled through the trees, a fierce reminder of the wilderness Samuel and Isaac had chosen to live in. The storm had started with a few flurries, but now it was a full-blown blizzard, the kind that could turn deadly if you weren't prepared. Samuel looked out at the swirling snow, his breath visible in the cold air, and for a moment he thought about abandoning the cabin. He could always return to his camp and finish later, after the storm passed. But deep down, he knew there was no time to waste. Isaac had already started moving logs into place inside the partially constructed cabin. The walls were nearly finished, and the roof, though still rough, had begun to take shape. The cylindrical structure stood defiantly against the storm, its shape forcing the snow and wind to slide off rather than impact directly. Samuel had designed it to be resilient, but now was the ultimate test. "Samuel, you coming in or what?" Isaac's voice called from inside, muffled by the wind. "I'll be right in," Samuel shouted back, pulling his coat tighter around him. He had to finish securing the last few logs before the storm worsened. The walls were almost complete, but the roof still needed more work. It wasn't just about shelter anymore. It was about ensuring that no matter what came next, the cabin would hold. The storm was fierce, but Samuel pushed forward. His fingers ached from the cold, and his movements grew slower with each passing hour. But he couldn't stop now. The cabin was more than just a building. It was his proof, his answer to the doubters. He couldn't let the storm take that away. When the last log was finally secured, Samuel staggered inside, shivering from the cold. Isaac had already built a small fire in the stone fireplace, the warmth immediately hitting Samuel like a wall. He collapsed onto a nearby bench, relieved to be out of the storm. "That should do it," Samuel said, wiping the snow from his face. "We've got the cabin finished, at least enough to survive this." Isaac smiled, sitting down beside him. "I knew it would hold. It's built to last, just like you said." Samuel looked around the cabin, his eyes scanning the walls, the roof, the door he had spent hours crafting. The warmth was already starting to settle in. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the cabin it was calm and still. The fire crackled, filling the air with a comforting warmth. For the first time since he began this project, Samuel felt a deep sense of accomplishment. The cabin wasn't just holding up against the storm, it was thriving. The warmth inside was proof that his design had worked, that the curves of the walls and the careful craftsmanship had created something that could withstand the harshest conditions. The tube cabin wasn't just a shelter, it was a testament to Samuel's resolve, his vision, and his refusal to settle for less. The storm continued to rage outside, but Samuel didn't mind. He had already won. The cabin had passed its first real test. The storm had finally passed, leaving behind a blanket of snow so thick that Samuel couldn't even see the path leading back to his camp. He had stayed inside the cabin for 2 days, keeping warm by the fire, watching the snow pile up against the walls. It was hard to believe how much had changed in such a short amount of time. The cabin had gone from being a mocked idea to a proven reality. Yet, as the storm cleared, Samuel knew the real test was just beginning. That afternoon, Samuel went out to inspect the cabin. The cold had settled in, but the temperature inside was still noticeably warmer than outside. The fire had burned low, but the heat remained trapped within the walls, kept in by the cabin's innovative design. Samuel couldn't help but smile as he tested the door. It was solid, no gaps, no weaknesses. The wind had no way of getting in. Still, there was something else he had to know. How would it fare when a real threat came knocking? He didn't have to wait long. As he walked back toward the cabin, he heard the unmistakable sound of a large animal moving through the snow. It was low at first, a subtle crunch of the earth beneath heavy paws. Then the sound grew louder, sharper, more deliberate. Samuel's heart skipped a beat. He knew exactly what it was. A grizzly. The bear's heavy steps grew closer. Samuel's pulse quickened, but his hands remained steady. He moved quickly, rushing to the gun port he had designed into the cabin wall. There, just outside the door, the grizzly appeared. Its massive frame loomed over the snow, sniffing the air, its eyes glinting in the afternoon light. The bear circled the cabin, testing the door, pushing against the walls. Samuel held his breath, watching through the gun port. He had spent countless hours designing every aspect of this cabin, ensuring that the walls were strong, the door reinforced, the roof secure. Now it was time to see if it would hold. The bear's claws raked across the door, but there was no give. It stood on its hind legs, its massive paws reaching for the windows, but the height of the walls kept it from making any progress. The bear sniffed at the air, clearly frustrated, but it couldn't break through. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, it gave up, disappearing back into the wilderness. Samuel stood there for a long moment, watching the bear vanish into the trees. The cabin had passed its first real test. The skeptics would be harder to convince, but Samuel didn't need their approval anymore. He had proven what needed to be proven. His cabin could stand up to anything. The wilderness threw its way. Samuel sat back against the cabin wall, watching as the last embers of the fire flickered out. The storm outside had passed, but its effects lingered in the air, cold, biting, relentless. Despite the harsh weather, Samuel felt warmth that didn't come from the fire. He couldn't stop smiling, despite his exhaustion. The cabin had held up during the storm, and now he knew for sure it worked. His design had worked. He had spent years dreaming of a shelter that could truly protect a man from the wilderness. He knew the dangers of the Rocky Mountains better than anyone, from the deadly winters to the ever-present threat of predators. The tube cabin was more than just a home. It was a fortress, a life-saving invention born out of necessity. But the real test had come last night. As the snow piled up outside and the wind howled around him, Samuel had sat in the quiet cabin, watching the temperature inside stay consistent. The warmth didn't fluctuate, didn't escape. It stayed, wrapped inside the walls, the roof, the tightly fitted logs. He had done it. For the first time in years, Samuel felt secure. The heat inside was a constant reminder that his vision had been right. The cylindrical shape, the carefully chosen materials, the reinforced structure, all of it had come together to create something truly remarkable. While the outside world froze in the grip of winter, Samuel's cabin remained comfortably warm. Even the coldest nights now felt bearable. He no longer had to worry about the dangers of frostbite or the desperate need for constant firewood. The cabin kept the heat in, even without the roaring fires he had been accustomed to. But the satisfaction of the successful test didn't last long. As Samuel sat there, resting his tired body, he heard a knock on the door. It wasn't the sharp clawing sound of a bear, but the distinct sound of a human knocking. He stood quickly, confused. Who could be coming out here in this storm? He opened the door cautiously, his hand resting on the rifle slung over his shoulder. Standing in the doorway, silhouetted by the dim light of the fire, was Isaac. His face was covered in frost, his coat thick with snow. "I thought I'd find you here," Isaac said, a grin spreading across his face. He shook the snow from his coat before stepping inside. "I figured you wouldn't be leaving the cabin any time soon, but I didn't expect you to be keeping it all to yourself." Samuel raised an eyebrow but stepped aside, allowing Isaac to enter. "You made it through the storm?" Isaac nodded. "Barely. But the cabin held up, huh? I knew it would. There's no way the cold's getting in, not when it's built like this." Samuel smiled, relieved to see Isaac's approval. The man's belief in the design meant more to him than he cared to admit. Isaac wasn't just another trapper. He was the first person to recognize the value of Samuel's work. The others had mocked him, but Isaac had stayed true to the vision. "I was right," Samuel said softly, a sense of pride swelling in his chest. "It really does work." Isaac stepped closer to the fire, his hands held out to warm up. "You've built something here, Samuel, not just a cabin. You've created something that could change everything for us. The others, they'll see it soon enough. It's not just warmth, it's safety." Samuel nodded, watching the fire flicker. He knew Isaac was right. This cabin wasn't just for him. It was for every trapper, every pioneer, and every man who had ever struggled to survive the brutal conditions of the Rockies. Samuel had created something more than just shelter. He had built a legacy. By the end of the week, word had spread. Trappers and settlers alike had begun to talk about Samuel's cabin, and while many remained skeptical, there were those who were intrigued. The idea of a cabin that could withstand the cold without constantly stoking a fire was something that caught the attention of those who lived and worked in the harshest parts of the Rockies. Samuel was still unsure if he wanted to share his creation. He had always been a solitary man, content with his own company and the company of only a few trusted people. But Isaac's confidence in the design had pushed him forward, and now the idea of his cabin becoming a symbol of innovation didn't seem as daunting as it once had. It didn't take long for the first curious visitor to show up. A trapper named William Marshall, who had been working a few miles away, made the journey through the deep snow to Samuel's cabin. When he arrived, his face was grim, but there was a flicker of something else in his eyes, interest perhaps, or even awe. "You built this?" William asked, his voice rough from the cold. He looked around the cabin, his eyes landing on the reinforced door, the solid logs, the carefully constructed walls. "I did," Samuel replied, his voice steady. "And it works. It'll hold up through the worst storms, the worst cold. I've been living here through the worst of it, and it's held strong." William took a step closer, inspecting the logs with a critical eye. "I'll admit I thought it was just another fool's dream, but now I'm starting to see what you meant." Samuel watched as the man ran his fingers along the walls, tracing the smooth surface of the logs, examining the sturdy construction. "You've built something here, Samuel, something that could save lives out here. I've seen plenty of men freeze because their cabins couldn't hold the warmth, and I've seen worse. This could make a real difference." For the first time since he had started the project, Samuel felt the weight of the work he had done. It wasn't just for him. It wasn't even just for Isaac or the few trappers who had seen it. It was for all of them, the men who lived and died in the wilderness, the ones who fought every day just to survive. Word continued to spread after that, and more trappers began to show up, all drawn by the rumors of Samuel's remarkable cabin. Some came skeptically, others with an open mind, but all left with a new respect for the innovation Samuel had created. And as the winter wore on, Samuel began to realize that his cabin, his design, was no longer just an experiment. It was the future. As the winter months dragged on, Samuel found that his cabin had become a refuge not just for himself but for others. Trappers who had been passing through the area, caught by the snow or too weary to continue their work, came to his door seeking shelter. Samuel had no qualms about offering a place to stay as long as they respected the cabin's rules. But one evening, just as the last light of day faded from the sky, the cabin would face a test that Samuel wasn't prepared for. It started quietly, a strange, almost imperceptible sound. The wind outside had died down, and the snow had softened into a gentle fall. The stillness of the evening, however, was suddenly broken by a low, guttural growl. Samuel froze, his hand instinctively reaching for the rifle by his side. Isaac, who had been sitting by the fire, stood up, his eyes scanning the room, as if trying to discern the source of the noise. "Did you hear that?" Isaac asked, his voice tight with concern. Samuel nodded, his senses on alert. He had heard the growl too, deep, menacing, unmistakable. A bear. It wasn't the first time the creature had approached the cabin, but this time something felt different. There was an urgency in its movements, a predator's intent. Samuel stepped toward the window, careful not to make a sound, and peered out into the darkness. The silhouette of a large bear appeared, its massive form lurching toward the cabin. The bear had been testing the structure for weeks now, pacing around the perimeter, scratching at the logs and sniffing at the door. But this time, it wasn't just curiosity that had drawn it in. It was hunger. Isaac had already moved to the gun port, his hand steady as he looked out at the creature. "It's bigger than the others," Isaac muttered. "That's a full-grown male." Samuel's mind raced. This wasn't just any bear. This one had the size and strength to break through. His cabin had passed previous tests, but this beast seemed intent on proving otherwise. The bear moved around the structure, testing each corner with its claws, trying to find a weak spot, a place where it could claw its way in. Samuel watched in tense silence as the creature's massive paw swiped at the door, leaving deep scratch marks in the wood. Isaac's voice cut through the tension. "It's going to keep coming back. It's not going to give up." Samuel's grip on the rifle tightened. He knew they couldn't afford to wait any longer. The bear had already proven how determined it was. If it succeeded in breaking through the door, the entire cabin would be compromised. "We need to scare it off," Samuel said firmly. "Now." Isaac nodded, his eyes never leaving the bear. They'd been through close calls before, but nothing like this. If they didn't act fast, this could turn into something much worse than just a test of the cabin's strength. This time, the bear might win. Samuel waited until the bear was a few feet from the door before firing. The shot rang out, splitting the silence of the night. The bear recoiled, its growl turning into a snarl of pain. It hesitated for a moment, then retreated back into the woods, disappearing into the snow. Samuel stood frozen for a moment, the adrenaline still coursing through his veins. The cabin had held. The door hadn't budged. The walls stood firm. But the danger wasn't over. They were not alone in this wilderness, and they never would be. The attack from the bear left Samuel and Isaac on edge for several days. The storm had passed, but the tension lingered. Samuel had never been one to shy away from danger, but this close call had made him realize just how vulnerable they were, even with the best preparation. The tube cabin had proven its worth. But the wilderness outside had a way of testing everything, even the most carefully constructed defenses. The news of the bear's attack spread quickly among the local trappers. As always, Samuel's cabin was the subject of conversation. Some had come to see the cabin for themselves, eager to witness firsthand how it withstood the test. Others remained doubtful, unwilling to admit that something as unconventional as Samuel's design could stand up to the harsh realities of the Rocky Mountains. John Carver, who had once been the loudest critic of Samuel's work, was among those who came to see the aftermath of the bear's encounter. He arrived early one morning, looking worn from the previous night's storm, his face etched with lines of exhaustion, but his expression softened when he saw Samuel standing by the door, inspecting the damage. "I heard about the bear," John said, his voice heavy. "Thought I'd come by and see if your little cabin really held up." Samuel didn't respond right away. He simply stood there, his eyes on the door. The marks left by the bear were visible, deep grooves where the claws had scraped against the thick logs. But despite the force of the attack, the door had held. The bear hadn't breached the cabin. "You're right," Samuel said finally, his tone measured. "It did hold up." John stepped closer, his eyes scanning the cabin's exterior. "I'll be damned," he muttered, shaking his head. "I've seen plenty of cabins, but I've never seen anything like this. I didn't think it was possible." For the first time, Samuel saw something different in John's eyes, a spark of respect. It was the kind of acknowledgement that Samuel had longed for, but it came at a cost. He had always been a man of quiet persistence, never looking for validation, yet in that moment he couldn't help but feel the weight of the change in perception. John didn't apologize. He didn't have to. The truth was clear now. Samuel's cabin had withstood a real test, and the critics could no longer ignore it. "That bear could have torn apart any other cabin," John said, his voice quieter now. "But this is something else. Something built to last." Samuel nodded, feeling the weight of the praise settle over him. The cabin wasn't just a success. It was changing the way people thought about survival in the wilderness. One test at a time, the critics were becoming believers. The weeks that followed the bear's attack brought new challenges, but also a growing sense of accomplishment for Samuel. The cabin had withstood the harshest tests the wilderness could throw at it, and the word of its success spread further than he had ever expected. More trappers came to see the cabin, some with skepticism, others with curiosity, but all of them left with a new respect for what Samuel had built. One of those who came by was William Marshall, the trapper, who had first spoken highly of Samuel's design. He had returned to offer help in constructing another cabin for a fellow trapper who had lost his shelter in a recent storm. As William worked alongside Samuel, he shared his thoughts on what made the tube cabin different. "You know, Samuel," William said one afternoon, wiping the sweat from his brow, "the more I think about it, the more I see the genius in your design. It's not just about keeping the cold out, it's about making the whole structure stronger. A rounded cabin like this can handle the pressure from all sides. The more I watch, the more I realize how much better it is." Samuel nodded, appreciating William's insight. For weeks he had known in his heart that his cabin was more than just a shelter. It was a way to make life easier, safer, and more sustainable for those who lived in the wilderness. But hearing it from someone else, someone with years of experience, made it all the more real. As he continued to work with William, Samuel couldn't help but reflect on how far he had come. He had started this project out of necessity, because he needed a better way to survive. But now, as he shared his design with others and helped them build their own cabins, he realized that this wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about creating something that would last, something that would improve the lives of those who came after him. With each passing day, more and more people began to adopt his techniques. The tube cabin, once ridiculed and dismissed, was becoming a symbol of ingenuity in the mountains. Trappers, settlers, and even the occasional traveler who wandered through the Rockies came to Samuel for advice, learning how to build cabins that could stand up to the harsh conditions of the wilderness. As he looked at the cabin he had built, Samuel felt a deep sense of pride. The structure had become more than just a home. It had become a legacy. It wasn't just a shelter from the cold, it was proof that with careful planning, hard work, and a little bit of innovation, even the toughest conditions could be overcome. Samuel's work had changed the way people thought about building in the Rockies. It had saved lives, provided warmth, and offered protection in a land where danger was never far away. And as he shared his design with others, he knew that his cabin would endure long after he was gone. One crisp morning in late spring, just as the snow began to melt and the first signs of new life appeared in the landscape, a rider appeared at Samuel's cabin. He came from the direction of the far-off settlements, riding through the fresh, muddy trails with urgency. Samuel was working on a new addition to his cabin, an extra layer of protection against the coming summer storms, when he saw the man approach, his horse moving swiftly through the thickening fog. The rider was tall and lean, his clothes worn from travel and his face etched with fatigue. As he neared, Samuel noticed the glint of something hanging from the man's belt, a badge, something Samuel had only seen on officials from the settlements. The rider reined in his horse as he reached the cabin, his eyes scanning the area before settling on Samuel. "I'm looking for Samuel Bridger," the rider called out, his voice deep but rough. "Are you he?" Samuel nodded, wiping his hands on his coat as he stepped forward. "I'm Samuel. What brings you out here?" The rider dismounted, his boots crunching in the snow as he approached. "I've heard of your work," the man said, looking around at the cabin with an appraising eye. "And I've come to offer you an opportunity." Samuel raised an eyebrow, unsure of what to expect. "An opportunity?" he asked cautiously. "What kind of opportunity?" The rider seemed to hesitate for a moment, as if weighing his words carefully. "I represent a group of settlers looking to establish a community further west. We've been hearing reports of attacks, of settlers losing everything to the elements. Your cabins, they've caught our attention. We're interested in having you build more of these cabins for us, more than just a few. We want you to help us build a whole settlement. You'd be in charge of designing and overseeing the construction." Samuel was taken aback. The idea of being in charge of an entire settlement, of overseeing the construction of multiple cabins, was more than he had ever considered. But the rider's words held weight. A whole community could benefit from the safety, warmth, and durability of his designs. It was a chance to spread his legacy even further. "I need time to think about it," Samuel said, his mind racing with possibilities. He had never imagined his work would lead to something like this, leading a group, overseeing a project that could change the lives of an entire community. The writer nodded, understanding the gravity of the offer. "Take all the time you need, but if you're interested, we'll be waiting. We need someone who knows how to survive in this land, and you're the one who can make it happen." As the writer rode off into the mist, Samuel stood there for a long time, his mind whirling. This wasn't just an opportunity, it was a challenge, one that could define the rest of his life. The days following the writer's visit were filled with contemplation. Samuel spent long hours sitting by the fire, his eyes staring into the flames, lost in thought. The idea of building a settlement, of overseeing a project of such scale, was both exhilarating and daunting. His cabin had already changed the way people thought about survival in the wilderness, but now the challenge was greater. He wasn't just designing homes for individuals. He was being asked to create a community, a network of shelters that could withstand the toughest winters and provide safety for everyone living there. At first, Samuel wasn't sure he was the right man for the job. He had built his own cabin out of necessity, a solution to the problems he faced every day in the world. But leading a group of men to build a whole settlement, that was a responsibility he had never considered. He knew that every decision he made would impact the lives of the people who would depend on him. It wasn't just about building a shelter, it was about creating a space where people could thrive, where families could live without fear of the wilderness creeping in. But as the days passed, Samuel's initial hesitation began to fade. He thought about the other trappers, the settlers, the families who could benefit from his design. The tube cabin had proven itself. It had kept him safe during brutal storms and protected him from the dangers of the wild. If he could extend that protection to others, if he could create a community where everyone had the chance to survive, he knew he had to take the opportunity. There was also the matter of the settlement itself. Samuel had never been part of a larger community before. He had always preferred the solitude of the wilderness, the quiet of the mountains where he could focus on his work and his survival. But the idea of a community, of sharing knowledge, of teaching others how to build better shelters, of helping those who had struggled to survive in the unforgiving landscape, felt like a new chapter in his life. It was a chance to give back, to ensure that others didn't have to face the same hardships he had. As he pondered the decision, Isaac was there by his side, as steady and dependable as always. Isaac had seen the transformation in Samuel over the past months, from the quiet, determined man who built the first tube cabin to the leader who was now being asked to shape the future of an entire community. Isaac didn't say much during their conversations, but Samuel could see the understanding in his eyes. Isaac knew what this meant, and he knew that Samuel had to follow his instincts. By the time Samuel made his decision, he had already mapped out a plan in his mind. He would take on the challenge. He would help build the settlement just as he had built his cabin step by step. And this time, he wouldn't be alone. Samuel had never been one to seek attention or praise, but as word of his involvement in the settlement spread, people began to take notice. Trappers from surrounding areas, settlers seeking refuge from the harsh conditions, and even a few entrepreneurs looking to capitalize on the growing demand for secure housing all came to Samuel for guidance. They had heard of his design, seen the success of his tube cabin, and they wanted to know how it could be applied to their own needs. At first, Samuel was reluctant to share his methods. He had worked for years to perfect his design, and the thought of others taking his ideas and using them without understanding the intricacies of his work made him nervous. But Isaac had encouraged him to teach, to pass on his knowledge. After all, it wasn't just about building for himself anymore. It was about creating something that could change the way people lived in the wilderness. So, Samuel began to teach. He gathered groups of settlers and trappers, walking them through the process of building the cabins, explaining the importance of choosing the right materials, of shaping the logs carefully, of reinforcing the corners and walls. He taught them how to insulate, how to construct roofs that would hold up against the weight of snow, how to make doors and windows that could withstand the pressure of animals or raiders. His reputation grew, and with it, the number of people who sought his guidance. The first few cabins built using Samuel's techniques were rough, the product of men who had little experience with construction. But with each new cabin, the workers learned more, and soon the design was being applied across the region. Samuel's influence began to spread not just through the trappers, but through the settlers who were starting to make their homes in the frontier. People began to see the wisdom in his design, the practicality of a structure built to withstand the elements and provide protection from predators. The more people adopted Samuel's design, the more he realized how far his work had come. What had started as a personal project born of necessity and tragedy was now changing the way people thought about survival in the mountains. Samuel wasn't just building cabins anymore, he was building a new way of life. And as he watched his designs take shape in the hands of others, he felt a deep sense of pride. This was his legacy, not just the cabins he had built, but the knowledge he had shared, the lives he had impacted. Years passed, and Samuel's cabin design became more than just a solution for a few isolated trappers. The principles he had developed, honed through experience and necessity, began to spread far beyond his own immediate circle. As the years wore on and the fur trade dwindled with the diminishing beaver populations, Samuel saw a change in the mountains. The rough, transient lifestyle of the mountain men was giving way to something new, a more permanent kind of settlement. And in these new communities, Samuel's cabins were becoming the foundation upon which everything was built. Samuel's name, once whispered with derision, was now spoken with respect in every cabin, camp, and trading post. The term Bridger-style cabin was becoming common vernacular among those who had come to understand the value of his designs. As the frontiersmen began to settle in the mountainous regions, they built homes that were more than just shelters. They were fortresses, designed to endure not just the winter's cold, but the unforgiving wilderness itself. Samuel had left the mountains long ago, retreating to a small ranch in Oregon, far from the cold winds and rugged landscape that had once defined his life. He had a family now, children who would never know the hardships of the Rocky Mountains, but the legacy of his work lived on. It wasn't just the physical cabins scattered across the region that stood as a testament to his ingenuity. It was the safety and security they provided, the assurance that men and women could live without fear of the wilderness taking them by surprise. The designs Samuel had perfected weren't merely structures. They were a way of life, a philosophy of survival that emphasized strength, foresight, and adaptation. The cabins Samuel had built had stood the test of time, much longer than the men who had originally inhabited them. The settlers who moved into the mountains in the mid-1800s found Samuel's cabins to be solid, reliable, and still capable of withstanding the harshest elements. Though the landscape had changed and new technologies emerged, the basic principles of Samuel's design remained invaluable. Samuel hadn't set out to change the course of history. He had only wanted to survive. But in his pursuit of a better life for himself and his partner John Hoffman, he had created something that would benefit generations to come. His work would outlive him, woven into the fabric of the American frontier. His cabins, scattered throughout the rugged terrain of Montana and Wyoming, had become a symbol of resilience and ingenuity. Despite the passing of time, Samuel's legacy continued to shape the way people built, lived, and adapted to the wilderness. His cabins didn't just provide shelter, they had become a cornerstone of survival in one of the harshest environments in the world. And even as Samuel's name faded from the collective memory of the settlers, his work stood firm, a silent testament to the perseverance and creativity of one man who had dared to think differently. In the years that followed, Samuel's story faded from the consciousness of most. To his children, he was simply a rancher who had made his way in the world. They knew nothing of the mountain man who had faced countless dangers, who had forged a new way of life in the wilderness, and who had changed the very landscape of frontier building. But the mark he had left on the land remained. etched into the log walls of every cabin built in his style. Even as new settlers moved west, searching for opportunities and new lives, Samuel's cabins continued to stand, silently enduring the test of time. The principles he had applied to his designs, careful craftsmanship, the practical use of materials, and the attention to detail, continued to influence generations of builders. The tube cabin, once laughed at and derided, was now considered the gold standard for frontier construction. Samuel had proven that survival was not about brute strength alone. It was about foresight, adaptability, and the ability to learn from the environment. Years passed, and Samuel's name became something of a legend, often spoken of in whispers. While the broader history of the American frontier often overlooked the quiet contributions of men like him, Samuel's work endured in a way that few other stories did. His cabins, built strong and durable, were still used by settlers who came after him, finding refuge in their warmth and security. For the men and women who settled in the harsh landscape of the Rockies, Samuel's cabins were more than just shelters. They were life-saving structures. In the decades after Samuel's death, his cabins continued to serve their purpose, often surviving decades longer than the men who had built them. Settlers and homesteaders who stumbled upon Samuel's cabins found refuge in their sturdy walls and strong construction. It wasn't uncommon for a traveler or a family passing through the mountains to find shelter in one of the Bridger-style cabins. Samuel's legacy extended beyond the physical structures he had built. It lay in the lives that were saved because his designs had withstood the harshest tests. It was in the lives of those who were able to live and thrive in places that would have otherwise been uninhabitable. His cabins had become symbols of security and endurance, of ingenuity and hard work. They stood as a silent reminder of one man's determination to do what was necessary, not just for himself, but for everyone who came after him. While Samuel never sought fame or fortune for his work, his story would eventually be told. It would be passed down from one generation to the next, as part of the larger narrative of the American frontier. The man who had once been mocked for his unconventional ideas had become a pioneer in the truest sense, a man who had changed the way people thought about survival in the wilderness. In the quiet of the mountains where Samuel had once walked, his legacy lived on. The cabin stood, weathered by time but still strong, as a testament to the enduring spirit of innovation, survival, and the unyielding determination of a man who had refused to settle for anything less than the best.